Greetings and welcome once again to the Gaming Codex, the show right to explain to you all the various terms and words used within video games and the video games industry. And today's term is that of pay to win. And what exactly would that mean? Well, according to a general definition, pay to win is the perception that the monetization of a game allows players that pay extra to gain an advantage over the rest of the player base to constantly dominate those that do not pay for the advantage, regardless of skill level or time spent playing. Usually, this is something common in free-to-play games, usually free-to-play MMOs, most of them coming from Korea or China. But within the last decade, it has diversified into pretty much every genre of video game, even those that are not free-to-play. And in some situations, it has even affected single-player games that do not have a tangible multiplayer component. It is, however, important to specify that it is a perception. Not every game called out for being pay to win is actually pay to win. It's just that some people are really sore losers and losers in general and will find any reason to complain that they lost other than them being not very good at a game. One good way through which you can tell if a game really is pay to win is just look at the in-game item mall, at the things you can buy in the game. If it's skins, that's not pay to win. If it's experience boosters, for example in an MMO, that allow you to gain levels faster, that is getting close to being pay to win, but it's not truly pay to win unless the bonus received for experience is quite large. For example, double the experience you would gain normally, which, let's face it, in some MMOs at higher levels is the only way to actually level up anymore. But when games start selling power or things that facilitate the acquisition of power, then it is outright pay to win. Premium ammo, for example, ammo that does more damage, ammo that is more powerful against an opponent, that is pay to win. Sure, it's important that you know how to play, absolutely. But if you have two players at the same skill level with identical equipment, but one of them uses the premium ammo and one doesn't, odds are the one with the premium ammo will win. Whereas if it were a convenience thing, like one player plays every day, the other one plays once every few days but used a experience booster to get to the same level as the other player, that won't really affect things that much. This is probably the most direct example I can give you about selling power, but there are more, and as I've said, they even cover single player games. Dead Space 3, which is primarily a single player or at least co-op video game, caused a lot of uproar by letting players, encouraging players to buy crafting equipment in order to get better weapons. Most of the Assassin's Creed series directly allows you to buy resources that you need to upgrade everything that you can upgrade in the game to get those things faster. Though it's not technically pay to win, it is annoying as hell. And then we had Shadow of War, which will let you buy a loot chest which could contain orcs that you would really need in order to actually do well in its multiplayer-ish kind of component. Not to mention the disasters that have befallen us in the case of Battlefront 2, which, I gotta remind you, is not a free game, and a lot of editions of it cost upwards of $60, ranging from $80 to even $100 if you're really enthusiastic about the game. Selling power is always a surefire way to ruin any kind of progression and any kind of hope that players have that they can continue playing without paying too much extra for the game. And sometimes it won't even be selling power, it'll be sectioning off portions of the game and blocking them behind a paywall. Portions of a game that are kind of required for a player to be able to progress further. And in some cases you even had the makers of an MMO bundle a bot with the game and lock it behind a paywall. This usually in games that are so goddamn boring that you will not really want to actually play them to level up because they're boring. Now, what is the popular definition? Well, that is that every damn free-to-play game has pay to win. I'm not saying that most free-to-play games are not pay to win. The majority of them are created this way so that people will pay money, a lot of money, as they play it. Otherwise, it will not really make a return on investment or ensure that the studio thrives and survives and somebody buys a gold-plated jet. But it's important to understand that no, not all free-to-play games are pay-to-win. There was always the perception that League of Legends was pay-to-win because all the new champions were just much more powerful than any of the older ones, and that's why whenever you played against them you always lost. And then after a while the characters would get patched and nerfed and then be easier to defeat. Yeah, there is an issue of balancing, absolutely, but there's always the issue of players never having fought against that character before and not knowing exactly how powerful they can be. The perception is important, and just because you perceive something as being unfair doesn't mean it actually is. A perfect example of this is MechWarrior Online, where you can pre-order the new generations of mechs that are being introduced in the game for around $20 to $50 depending on how many of them you want and in what variants and what colors and if they should be hero mechs or painted or stuff. When clan mechs were added especially, this was perceived as being absolutely pay to win because, as we all know, clan mechs are absolutely better. And they are, on paper, they are made even in the lore to be better. So having them be exclusive for a while to the players that pre-ordered them seemed like the game was going to be pay to win. But there is one problem here. It is not a 1v1 game. Well, it is now. It has the option now, but for the most part it isn't, meaning that it requires an entire team to work for an objective. And teamwork counts a lot more in that game than any kind of mech being used. More importantly than that, skill, actual skill, means the difference between a Timberwolf blasting away at an entire enemy lance and that Timberwolf being murdered by a spider that costs about a fifth of what that big mech does. But if the players did have similar skill levels, then it would actually be kind of an even fight, because a big mech like the Timberwolf is not made to be quick. It's not made to turn around really fast, and it's also not made to be indestructible. You can still shoot it repeatedly in the back and be done with it if you're spry enough. And if it's just two players of the same skill, both in Timberwolves, there's absolutely nothing you can buy in the game to differentiate between the two of you. And since most situations are in 12v12 combat, it all boils down to who has better communication and someone that understands how to give orders, when to give orders, and if everybody else understands when to follow them. Now, what is the marketing definition of pay to win? Well, that'd be, it's not such a bad idea now, is it? We just have to spin it as a $100 shallow multiplayer only game being too expensive to make, and so we have to monetize it up the wazoo. There used to be a time when pay to win again was something associated only with free-to-play games, usually MMOs. Ones made kind of for cheap in some places of the world with developers that weren't really, big names, at least not here in the West. But as I've said, things changed. You started seeing Western developers experimenting with things like Battlefield Heroes, which was a Team Fortress 2 ripoff before that was cool. Stylistically, I mean, I know Battlefield existed before it. And it's a game where you could not really survive without microtransactions because none of the weapons were permanent and they cost a heck of a lot. And that evolved into single-player games, as you've seen, and of course they've been a mainstay of multiplayer games, causing much controversy, always with the explanation that games are expensive to make and therefore need a lot of monetization in order to actually be viable. On the other hand, you do see people like CD Projekt making bigger games, more ambitious games, gigantic games that do not have in-game monetization at all. Now, I'm not saying that companies like Electronic Arts are full of bullshit when they say that their games are expensive to make. They live in a more expensive place than Poland, with higher salaries, higher benefits that need to be paid, medical insurance costs a lot more, taxes, they don't pay any because they're American companies and they don't really do that, but the games are more expensive to make. However, if it sells 10 million and it still hasn't made back its money, heck, if it sells 4 million, if it sells 3 and hasn't made back its investment, then it was kind of a really botched, horrible idea to begin with, especially if we're talking about something like Battlefront, which is surprisingly still shallow compared to much older games with the same name. But of course, you do also have games that are indeed gigantic and sprawling and very complex, like GTA 5 and its online component that is absolutely pay to win, without a doubt. but it needed to be at first at least because the game cost around $400 million to make and market, and they've made that up like 50 times already, I think. Doesn't mean they'll stop. Sadly, doesn't mean anybody will stop, because they've seen that pay to win is actually successful. People will pay to win. They absolutely will. They have. They're gonna keep doing it. So there's no incentive to stop. Oh sure, we have some controversies like the loot boxes and Shadow of War and then Battlefront 2, but people will forget about them. People have kind of already forgotten about them, and they'll just be a mainstay of video games. More microtransactions, more pay to win, and nobody will mind anymore. Oh sure, there will be some people screaming, but they'll be ignored. The war is over. We've lost. So closes another edition of the Gaming Codex. Come back next time and we'll talk about a brand new subject. Goodbye.